History says Anne of Cleves was too disgusting for Henry VIII to touch. But the real secret? It was Henry who was rotting, and what Anne discovered in that royal bedchamber would make her the only wife to truly defeat him. Stick around, because the way she used his darkest secret to not just survive, but win, will change everything you thought you knew about this story. What if I told you that in 1539, the most powerful man in England was hiding behind layers of silk and gold, desperately concealing a body that was decomposing while he still lived? Henry VIII wasn't just aging, he was rotting. His legs, wrapped in bandages soaked with pus and blood, required constant medical attention that Tudor physicians couldn't provide. The infection had spread so deep into his bones that every step brought agony, and the sweet, sickly smell of decay followed him through Hampton Court's gilded corridors. Courtiers learned a terrible skill, breathing through their mouths whenever the king entered a room. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the stench, carefully coded in diplomatic language that couldn't quite hide their revulsion. This wasn't the athletic prince who had once jousted and danced his way through European courts. This was something else entirely, a walking corpse wearing a crown, and he knew it. The knowledge aided him worse than any infection. Henry's massive ego, once fed by genuine physical prowess and sexual conquests, now had nothing to sustain it except lies. And he was about to meet a woman who would become the victim of those lies. The medical reality was even grimmer than the visible symptoms suggested. Modern doctors examining Tudor records believe Henry suffered from osteomyelitis, a bone infection that was essentially a death sentence in the 16th century, just stretched out over years of excruciating suffering. His physicians applied everything from boiled onions to powdered human skull directly to the wounds, desperate remedies that did nothing except add to his torment. The liberal doses of opium they prescribed to manage his pain created a new problem: a king whose judgment was clouded by narcotics, making him paranoid, unpredictable, and dangerously impulsive. But here's the secret Henry could never, ever admit. The infection had destroyed more than just his legs. His circulation was compromised, his hormones disrupted, and the physical capability for intimacy that had once defined his masculine identity was gone. For a king who had broken with Rome partly to satisfy his sexual desires, who had executed 2 wives and divorced another in his quest for sons and validation, this physical failure was unbearable. He needed someone to blame, and Anne of Cleves was about to walk straight into that trap. What makes this tragedy even darker is that Henry's court physicians understood the truth but could never speak it. To suggest that the king's body had failed him would be treason, or at minimum career death. So they became accomplices in what would happen next, ready to diagnose phantom illnesses in whoever Henry blamed for his inadequacy. The stage was set for one of history's most elaborate cover-ups, and it would require the complete destruction of an innocent woman's reputation. But here's what Henry didn't count on. Anne of Cleves was far smarter than anyone gave her credit for, and she would eventually turn his dark secret into her greatest weapon. The question wasn't whether she would survive his lies, but how she would use them to win a game Henry didn't even know he was playing. Picture this: a 24-year-old German princess spending months preparing to become Queen of England, completely unaware she's being set up to fail. Anne of Cleves studied English, practiced new dance steps, and filled her dowry chest with treasures meant to impress her future husband. Meanwhile, Henry was staring obsessively at Holbein's portrait of her, building fantasies that had nothing to do with the real woman and everything to do with his desperate need for validation. His courtiers, understanding exactly what the king wanted to hear, embellished every detail: her skin like cream, her eyes sparkling with intelligence, her figure perfectly suited to bear royal sons. They were essentially writing fan fiction about a woman they'd never met, creating an impossible standard that would doom Anne the moment she arrived. The Protestant alliance Henry needed hung on this marriage, but his diseased ego was already sabotaging it. Every compliment his advisors invented, every exaggeration about Anne's beauty, raised expectations that no mortal woman could meet, especially not one expected to magically cure a king's sexual dysfunction through sheer attractiveness. When Henry decided to surprise Anne at Rochester, disguised as a humble messenger in what he thought was romantic, courtly tradition, he was staging a test she couldn't possibly pass. He wanted instant recognition, passionate attraction, the kind of scene from romance tales where the heroine sees through any disguise to recognize her true love. What he got instead was a confused German princess, raised in formal court protocols, politely wondering why this strange man had burst into her chambers. Anne's reaction was perfectly appropriate for someone from her cultural background. Dignified, measured, slightly bewildered. But to Henry, it was devastating proof that she didn't find him irresistible, that his disguise worked too well because his legendary charisma had vanished along with his health. The rage that darkened his face in that moment wasn't just disappointment, it was panic. If Anne didn't desire him instantly, if she required time to develop affection, then his dark secret would be exposed. He needed a woman who would cover for his inadequacy by appearing so smitten that consummation seemed irrelevant. Anne's polite confusion shattered that hope, and Henry's revenge began immediately. Within hours of that disastrous meeting, courtiers who had praised the coming union were suddenly discovering concerns about Anne's appearance, her manners, her foreign ways. These weren't genuine observations. They were carefully calibrated performances designed to give Henry the justification he craved. The whispers spread like poison through the court. Perhaps the portrait had been too flattering. Perhaps Germanic standards of beauty differed from English refinement. Perhaps the religious alliance wasn't worth this personal sacrifice by their beloved king. Every criticism served the same purpose, building a narrative where Henry's rejection of Anne would seem justified, even noble rather than the desperate cover-up it actually was. And Anne, arriving in England with such hope and preparation, walked straight into a spider's web where every thread had been spun to trap her. But the true horror was still to come, in a royal bedchamber where Henry's dark secret would be revealed and immediately transformed into Anne's supposed failure. The wedding on January 6, 1540, was a masterclass in public humiliation, disguised as royal celebration. Henry stood there in cloth of gold, his infected legs hidden beneath expensive fabric, while Anne wore robes that couldn't disguise the cold fury radiating from her new husband. Foreign diplomats, trained to read the subtle language of court politics, immediately understood something was catastrophically wrong. The way Henry avoided looking at Anne, the forced quality of his smiles, the tension in every ceremonial gesture, it all screamed disaster. But the real nightmare wouldn't begin until the doors of the royal bedchamber closed, and Anne discovered the truth that Henry had been hiding from everyone, including himself. That night would define everything that followed. Not because of anything Anne did or didn't do, but because Henry's body would finally, undeniably betray him, and he would need to destroy her reputation to survive the revelation. What happened in that room became the dark secret at the heart of this entire tragedy. Imagine being Anne in that moment. A virgin bride facing a husband whose body was wrapped in stinking bandages, whose flesh was literally rotting, who approached the marriage bed with the enthusiasm of a man facing execution. The infected leg ulcers that Henry's physicians had wrapped so carefully began leaking through the silk sheets, filling the room with the sweet, sick smell of decay. And then came the moment of ultimate truth. Henry couldn't perform. His diseased body, ravaged by infection and pumped full of opium, simply wouldn't cooperate no matter how desperately his ego demanded it. For a king who had spent decades defining his masculinity through sexual conquest, who had restructured an entire religion partly to satisfy his desires, this failure was apocalyptic. But here's where the dark secret truly took shape. Instead of acknowledging his own physical limitations, Henry immediately began crafting lies about Anne. Her body was wrong, her smell was off, her foreign nature had somehow corrupted his natural responses. These weren't just excuses whispered in private shame. They were calculated accusations he would spread throughout the court, transforming his impotence into her inadequacy. The physicians who examined Henry the next morning faced an impossible situation. They could see the obvious medical causes of his dysfunction, the infection, the pain, the medication clouding his system. But to say so would be professional death or worse. So they became collaborators in Henry's lie, inventing diagnoses that blamed external factors for the king's failure. And, they suggested, might have unusual humors or Germanic characteristics that disrupted English masculine vigor. These medical opinions, complete nonsense by any scientific standard, provided official validation for Henry's narrative. And this is where the cover-up became systematic. Henry's lies about that night weren't just personal deflection, they were state-sponsored propaganda designed to rewrite reality itself. Courtiers whispered his version in corridors, ladies-in-waiting reported invented flaws in Anne's appearance and habits. And within days, the entire court had accepted a completely fabricated story about why their king couldn't consummate his marriage. The real dark secret, Henry's rotting, failing body and shattered ego, was buried beneath layers of lies about Anne. And history would repeat those lies for 5 centuries. What happened next reveals just how far Henry would go to protect his secret. Anne found herself surrounded by spies disguised as servants. ladies-in-waiting who reported her every word and gesture to the king's representatives. They mocked her Germanic accent with theatrical cruelty, turned her unfamiliarity with English customs into evidence of fundamental inadequacy, and even criticized her choice of perfumes as further proof of her unsuitability. This wasn't casual xenophobia, it was orchestrated character assassination designed to make Henry's rejection seem not just justified, but inevitable. Every cruel joke, every whispered insult, every exaggerated report of her foreign behavior served to build a narrative where Anne was the problem, never Henry. The sophistication of this campaign shows how threatened Henry felt. He wasn't just disappointed in a wife. He was terrified that his dark secret would be exposed, that people would realize the great Henry VIII could no longer perform the most basic function of masculine identity. So Anne had to be destroyed completely, her reputation so thoroughly shredded that no one would ever question Henry's version of events. The most sickening aspect of this systematic destruction was the medical examinations Anne was forced to endure. Royal physicians acting under Henry's orders conducted intimate inspections of her body, searching for the defects the king claimed to perceive. These violations, conducted under the guise of medical necessity, were nothing more than ritualized humiliation designed to provide official documentation of Anne's supposed inadequacy. The physicians' reports, carefully worded to support Henry's narrative, would be preserved in royal records as historical evidence of why the marriage failed. Think about the psychological torture of this. Being examined by men looking for flaws to justify your husband's rejection, knowing that these reports would follow you forever, that history itself was being rewritten to cast you as the villain in your own humiliation. Anne endured these examinations with the same dignified silence she brought to everything else. But inside, she must have understood the full scope of Henry's cruelty. He wasn't just ending their marriage, he was attempting to erase her dignity, her humanity, and her truth from history itself. While Anne suffered this public crucifixion, Henry had already moved on to his next target. Catherine Howard, a teenage girl whose youth promised to validate what his diseased body could no longer deliver. Catherine represented everything Anne wasn't: English, young, inexperienced, and too naive to recognize the trap she was walking into. Henry's pursuit of her began before his marriage to Anne was even formally dissolved. A calculated insult designed to demonstrate that the problem was never his inadequacy, but Anne's failure to inspire him. Court observers watched in fascination and horror as the king's attention shifted, his demeanor brightening whenever Catherine appeared, while his interactions with Anne became perfunctory and cold. The message was clear: Henry could desire a woman, just not this one. And therefore the fault lay entirely with Anne's inadequacy rather than his dysfunction. But here's the bitter irony Anne must have recognized even then. Catherine Howard's youth and eagerness wouldn't save her any more than Anne's dignity had. Henry's dark secret would eventually consume Catherine too. Because the problem was never about his wives, it was always about him. The annulment machinery ground forward with the same ruthless efficiency that had destroyed Thomas More and John Fisher. Legal scholars discovered convenient impediments to the marriage's validity. Theologians crafted arguments about consent and consummation that defied logic. And parliamentary committees interviewed witnesses who understood exactly what testimony would preserve their lives. Anne's foreign birth became retroactive evidence of problems, while Henry's claims of non-consummation were accepted without the slightest scrutiny despite being obvious lies. The proceedings resembled show trials more than legitimate inquiries, with predetermined outcomes and scripted testimonies that made a mockery of English justice. But the truly insidious part was how they turned Anne's cooperation against her. When she agreed to testify about the marriage's failure, court observers noted her unnatural willingness to discuss intimate matters. When she remained silent about Henry's cruelty, this was interpreted as proof of her foreign inability to understand English emotional expression. Every choice she made was twisted to support the narrative of her inadequacy, creating a perfect logical trap where resistance proved defiance and compliance proved unworthiness. Then came July 9th, 1540, the day that exposed the true cost of knowing Henry's secrets. Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had arranged the Cleves alliance, was executed on Tower Hill for the crime of serving his king too well. The man who had negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, and strengthened England's Protestant position paid with his life while Anne dined safely at Richmond Palace. The timing wasn't coincidental. Cromwell died on the same day Henry married Catherine Howard, a piece of brutal theater that sent a clear message about the price of failure and the rewards of pleasing the king. But there was a darker purpose to Cromwell's execution beyond simple scapegoating. He knew everything. Every detail of how Henry's rejection of Anne had been orchestrated, every lie that had been told, every medical reality that had been concealed. His death wasn't just punishment, it was the elimination of a witness who could expose the entire cover-up. With Cromwell gone, only the official narrative remained, and Henry's dark secret was safe. The cruel symbolism of that day revealed everything about Tudor power. Death and renewal, punishment and reward, the old order destroyed to make way for the new. And Anne forced to witness it all. She was expected to attend the wedding celebrations, to smile graciously and congratulate the girl who had replaced her, adding one final layer of humiliation to her public degradation. But here's what no one understood at the time, least of all Henry. Anne had already won. By accepting the terms of her annulment, by playing the role of compliant victim, she had secured something none of Henry's other wives would achieve: freedom. While Catherine Howard walked into the same trap that had nearly destroyed Anne, while Henry's diseased ego sought validation through another doomed relationship, Anne was building the foundation for a victory that would take years to become apparent. She had learned the dark secret at the heart of Henry's power. The king was weak, not strong, broken, not mighty, desperate, not confident. And that knowledge would be her weapon. Anne's transformation from rejected queen to the king's beloved sister gave her something revolutionary for a woman in Tudor England: genuine independence. Her estates weren't just economic security, they were freedom from Henry's physical presence, from court surveillance, from the deadly politics that consumed everyone who remained too close to the king. The irony was savage but undeniable. Rejection had liberated her from a fate that might well have ended on the scaffold. While Catherine Howard would be arrested, tried, and executed within 18 months of her wedding, Anne managed her properties in peace, diversified her investments, and built an economic empire that made her genuinely wealthy, independent of royal favor. Her account books reveal business acumen that contradicted every assumption about feminine capability in financial matters. She negotiated favorable leases, introduced continental farming techniques that improved productivity, and invested in trade ventures connecting English and German markets. The woman Henry had dismissed as inadequate was proving herself superior to most English nobles in vision and execution. But Anne's brilliance went beyond mere survival. She was building a network of power that existed entirely outside official recognition. Her household became an unofficial German embassy where merchants sought assistance, scholars found patronage, and Protestant refugees discovered protection. She maintained careful correspondence with her brother Duke Wilhelm and other German princes, providing intelligence about English politics while never quite crossing into espionage. This delicate balance required extraordinary diplomatic skill, appearing loyal to English interests while secretly serving as an informal ambassador for Protestant German states. Her investments created jobs, her charitable foundations funded schools and hospitals, and her reputation among ordinary English people gradually transformed from rejected foreign queen to respected benefactor. Meanwhile, Henry's condition worsened, his leg infection spreading, his mobility declining, his grip on reality loosening under the constant application of opium. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Anne thriving while the king who had rejected her descended further into physical and mental decay. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 marked Anne's final liberation from the man who had tried to destroy her. Unlike courtiers who had tied their fortunes too closely to the dying king's favor, Anne's independence and neutral political stance positioned her perfectly for the new reign. Edward VI's Protestant government valued her continental connections and theological expertise, while her reputation for wisdom made her a trusted advisor during the uncertain early years of the boy king's rule. But the real test came with Mary Tudor's accession in 1553, when England lurched from Protestant Reformation back to Catholic Restoration. Anne's relationship with Mary, despite their religious differences, demonstrated her remarkable ability to transcend the sectarian divisions tearing Tudor England apart. Mary respected Anne's intelligence and diplomatic experience, often seeking her counsel on matters involving German states and continental politics. This relationship proved crucial. While Protestant reformers fled or were burned, Anne remained secure, protected by personal respect that transcended religious ideology. When Anne of Cleves died peacefully in 1557, she was buried in Westminster Abbey with honors befitting royalty. A stark contrast to Catherine of Aragon dying in exile, Anne Boleyn executed, Jane Seymour dead from childbirth complications, Catherine Howard beheaded, and Catherine Parr outliving Henry but dying young. Anne had achieved what seemed impossible. She had not just survived Henry VIII, but defeated him completely. Her funeral was attended by nobility and foreign diplomats who recognized her remarkable journey from humiliated bride to accomplished matriarch. The woman who had been publicly degraded by a diseased tyrant was laid to rest with genuine respect and admiration. But the real victory wasn't just personal, it was moral and philosophical. Anne had proven that dignity could survive systematic humiliation, that intelligence could triumph over brute power, that sometimes the greatest revenge wasn't fighting monsters but refusing to become one yourself. She built institutions that served communities for generations, created economic innovations that influenced English farming practices, and established a legacy of genuine achievement that none of Henry's other wives could claim. Here's the final revelation that ties everything together. For 500 years, historians repeated Henry's lies without question, perpetuating myths about the inadequate foreign queen who disgusted her royal husband through her own failings. But modern scholarship has finally pierced through those deceptions, and the truth is devastating to Henry's carefully constructed narrative. The real stench in the Tudor court came not from Anne's body or clothing, but from Henry's ulcerated legs and diseased soul. The rot that contemporaries whispered about belonged not to the foreign queen, but to the English king whose vanity and cruelty poisoned everyone around him. Every criticism Henry leveled at Anne, the smell, the inadequacy, the corruption, was pure projection, his own failures transformed into her supposed defects. The dark secret he tried so desperately to bury wasn't about Anne at all. It was about him, his rotting body, his sexual dysfunction, his shattered ego, his complete inability to accept responsibility for his own physical limitations. And Anne knew it from that first night in the royal bedchamber. That knowledge became her power. By accepting humiliation publicly while understanding the truth privately, Anne secured her survival and eventually her triumph. She played the role Henry demanded, the inadequate wife grateful for merciful treatment, while building a life of genuine accomplishment that exposed his lies through simple existence. Every year she thrived was another year proving that the problem had never been her inadequacy, but his. Every institution she founded, every life she improved, every respect she earned demonstrated capabilities that contradicted Henry's narrative of her worthlessness. The woman dismissed as inadequate became a model of competence. The foreign queen mocked for her ways became a respected figure in English society. The wife rejected for failing to arouse desire built an economic empire and cultural legacy. And meanwhile, Henry VIII, the man who had blamed her for his own failures, descended into accelerating decay. His body consumed by the same corruption he had projected onto her, his legacy tarnished by cruelty and excess. The bitter scoreboard of this Tudor tragedy speaks for itself. Henry VIII died in 1547, his body so bloated with corruption that his lead coffin reportedly burst from the pressure of decomposing gases, a grotesque final symbol of the rot that had consumed him from within. Anne of Cleves lived another decade, dying peacefully in her comfortable estates in 1557, surrounded by friends and mourned by communities she had served through charity and kindness. The king who had blamed her for his inadequacy became a literal monument to decay. The woman he had publicly humiliated built a legacy of genuine achievement and respect. History has finally begun correcting the record, stripping away centuries of lies to reveal a truth Henry tried desperately to bury. The dark secret at the heart of his fourth marriage was never about Anne's inadequacy. It was always about his own failure, physically and morally. And by surviving, by thriving, by building something beautiful from the ashes of his cruelty, Anne of Cleves exposed that secret more thoroughly than any accusation could have. So when someone mentions Anne of Cleves as the lucky wife who escaped with her head, remember the full truth buried beneath that simplification. She didn't just survive, she won. She achieved through patience and wisdom what none of Henry's other wives could accomplish through defiance or submission. She turned his dark secret into her shield, his lies into her liberation, his cruelty into her greatest weapon. The smell of corruption that supposedly surrounded Anne of Cleves? It was nothing more than the projection of a dying tyrant's putrid soul, and she proved it by outliving him and building a legacy that honored truth over power, dignity over domination, life over death. In the end, the joke was entirely on Henry VIII. The man who tried to bury his dark secret by destroying an innocent woman's reputation became history's perfect example of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, while the woman he tried to erase became proof that grace and intelligence can triumph over brutality and ignorance. If this story changed how you see Tudor history, Hit that subscribe button because we're exposing more buried truths that challenge everything you thought you knew. Drop a comment telling me which of Henry's wives you want us to investigate next. Because trust me, there are more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. And smash that like button if you believe Anne of Cleves deserves to be remembered, not as the lucky one who kept her head, but as the brilliant strategist who defeated a tyrant by refusing to play his game. Your engagement tells YouTube to share these hidden histories with more people who need to hear the truth. Anne of Cleves spent centuries being misunderstood. Let's make sure her real story finally gets the audience it deserves.